We are sort of on the wrap-up phase of our Bible study series on the Old Testament. We're completing the books of 2nd Chronicles and 2nd Kings this evening, and next Bible study we will do a survey on Ezra and Nehemiah, and that will really have brought us through the historical flow of the Old Testament, and we will do a Bible study on the time between the Testaments, and then get into the New Testament. So we'll come back and pick up all of the books that weren't a part of this particular Bible study in later series. The break point that we came to last time here in 2 Kings 1 and 2, of course, had to do with the taking up of Elijah in the chariot of fire in the whirlwind, and Elisha succeeding him as God's servant. Now, if you notice here, as the story picks up here in chapter 3 of 2 Kings, we will primarily use 2 Kings and pick up the parallel accounts in 2 Chronicles when there are details that are significant that are added in. What we find here at this point, and that this brings us down to the time when Jehoram, who was the son of Ahab, began to reign in Samaria. This was during the latter time of Jehoshaphat's reign, and this is the, if you have the chronology chart, it sort of gives you the story here. What we find is that there was an intermarriage here between the royal line of Judah and the line of Israel. The story is, of course, that Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram, married actually the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, Athaliah, and this gives rise to problems in Judah, because once her husband died and her son only reigned briefly, then she took over as king, sought to kill all her grandchildren, and ensconce herself as queen. So you get a little bit of the idea of the character of the person involved. One of the things at this period in history that's a little bit confusing is the names of the kings of Israel and Judah are almost the same. They were all family related, and they seem to have named their kids after one another, and it gets to be a little bit confusing. But anyway, as we pick up the story here this evening, the opening part of 2 Kings tends to focus more on Elisha and some incidents of his ministry that we will look at. As we come on down, what we will find is that as some time has passed, the 8th century becomes a time of great material prosperity in both Israel and Judah. There were two long-lived kings, Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam II of Israel, and there was a sort of a peak of material prosperity that is reached, and some of these things are commented upon in some of the minor prophets which were written at that general time period. The book of Micah in particularly, Amos also makes comment on some of these things. Jonah, the prophet Jonah, who wrote the book of Jonah, is mentioned in the account as in his interaction with King Jeroboam II. That's not the theme of his book, but it is mentioned in the account here in King's Chronicles. It's interesting that as you look, and gives us a little bit of insight in terms of how God works, the greatest time of prophetic activity, if you look at it, the two significant times of quite a number of prophets right around the same time was the time right here prior to the fall of Israel, and then later the next cluster is right around the time of the fall of Judah. And it ties in with the principle that when God is preparing to intervene, when God is going to judge His people, He sends a warning. He sends a witness. And you find that Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Isaiah, who was a little bit later than them, but all they overlapped in terms of time period. All of these come, let's say, in the last 2/3 or 3/4 of the 8th century, and as a prelude to the Assyrian captivity. So God sent prophet after prophet, even as far off the track as Israel was. God sent prophet after prophet to warn them, and of course raised up a righteous king in Judah, Hezekiah. The final warning actually came through Hezekiah, and it centered around whether the people were willing to repent and go and observe God's holy days, or whether they would not. Israel, of course, from the days of the division of the kingdom, from the days of Jeroboam I, had turned away from going to Jerusalem, from observing God's holy days as they should have been observed. So this story we get into, and of course what we find is that Judah had a couple of outstanding kings during this time period, particularly Hezekiah and Josiah. And Josiah was the great-grandson of King Hezekiah. And these two men were very devoted to God in their approach and their attitude. But what we find is that the people conformed to the leanings of the king, but they didn't genuinely repent and seek God. And there's a big difference between someone conforming and sort of going along. When Hezekiah straightened things out, when Josiah straightened things out, what you find is outwardly the nation got back on track. But as you read the accounts, you realize what they did was they conformed to the leader. And then as soon as the leader died and they got a wicked leader, well, they conformed to him. Which sort of brings to mind events in the church. You know, Mr. Armstrong, in the aftermath of his heart attack beginning January of 79, focused the last 7 years of his life on putting the church back on track. And he talked over and over about putting the church back on track. And you find all sorts of people who were around who, in retrospect, they conformed to the leader's wishes. But there's a big difference between conforming to the leader's wishes and genuinely repenting in terms of your relationship with God. And, of course, when the leader, whether it was King Hezekiah or King Josiah, or in our day, Mr. Armstrong, when he died, we find that there was not a lot of depth to what a lot of people had done. And there's, these things are here as examples and as lessons for us to realize it's not enough simply to conform and to go along. You've got to walk with God. God's got to be real to you. Elijah had gotten discouraged. We went into it last time, and he told God, he said, I'm the only one left. Everybody has forsaken you. And God says, no, not everybody. There's 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. Now you figure Israel had a population of a few million. 7,000 doesn't represent very many, a pretty small percentage. But nevertheless, there were a handful during the reign of even wicked King Ahab and Jezebel. There were a handful of people who simply did not conform God was real to them, and they really sought to obey God. And that is always the case. As we go on in here, we find that Jehoram, son of Ahab, began to reign over Israel, chapter 3, verse 1, in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat. And he reigned 12 years. He did not do as badly as his father and mother. He did put away the image of Baal, but he nevertheless continued to cleave to the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. It's interesting, over and over you've got this refrain, Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. You know, old sins can cast long shadows. Israel never got back on track from what Jeroboam did. And his name is used over and over and over. As the story comes through here in 2 Kings chapter 3, Jehoram goes to Jehoshaphat again. You know, Ahab had gone to Jehoshaphat, and now Jehoram goes to Jehoshaphat. And actually, Jehoram's sister is married to Jehoshaphat's son. Jehoshaphat allowed himself to get entangled and to sort of be sucked into some things, and this is part of the story here. We'll find that he continued to get sort of entangled on this, but Jehoshaphat was a man that seemingly felt sorry for folks, and so he was going to bail them out. He was going to help out Jehoram, and came down there, and Jehoshaphat asked when he came up there to help him in chapter 3, verse 11 of 2 Kings. He said, "Isn't there a prophet of the Lord that we may inquire? We'd like to inquire of the Lord. You know, I'm not going to go out there." And they said, "Well, you know, there's Elisha." And so Jehoshaphat said, "Well, I know the word of the Lord is with him." And so they went, and Elisha was a pretty bold fellow. He told the king of Israel in verse 13, he says, what do I have to do with you? Why don't you get to the prophets of your father and your mother? And, you know, what are you calling me for? And then Jehoshaphat, or Elisha went on to tell him in verse 14, if it weren't for Jehoshaphat here, I wouldn't look toward you nor see you. I wouldn't pay any attention to you, wouldn't answer any question you have, wouldn't have any regards for anything. But I respect him, and so you know, God did deliver them at this point, Israel and Judah. Now, chapter 4 begins the story here of various actions of Elisha's ministry, and we start out here in chapter 4 with a certain woman who was a widow, evidently a young widow. She had been married to one of the students of Elijah, one of the sons of the prophets brings out, and her husband had died, and she was in debt. And I remember years ago when I was an ambassador, we used to read that. We sort of relate to the sons of the prophets, and we figured that times hadn't changed much. The sons of the prophets were still in debt, you know, all that time later in terms of things. But anyway, she comes to Elisha, and she's very concerned because their creditors are going to come, threatening to come take her sons away. And Elisha said, "Well, what do you have?" And she said, "Well, I've just got a little bit of oil. Don't really have anything." And he told her, "Go and borrow vessels from your neighbors." And so she went in and did that. And the story, of course, is that she started pouring oil. And she filled up every empty vessel that she had. And then she was able to sell that and pay her debt and have some money to live on. You know, it's interesting. She needed a miracle of God. She was anticipating and looking for a miracle of God. She had to be prepared to receive that miracle. she'd only gone and put out 1 or 2 empty pots. That's all the oil she would have gotten. If you pray and ask God to do something, prepare to receive it. If you're, if the blessing arrives and you're not prepared to receive it, then it might as well not have arrived. We have to, in that sense, prepare to be a proper recipient of God's blessings. Now, a little bit later, it goes on and tells the story of Elisha being invited by this prominent family. Mentions the woman in particular. She seems to have been the one that took the lead in making the suggestion, but her husband was amenable to it, and inviting Elisha to stay with them. And they built a little room, a little chamber that was there, and when Elisha passed through, he had a place to stay. So this went on for a while, and one day Elisha decided to call this woman and ask her what she would like. He would like to do something as a token of appreciation. And finally it came up, she and her husband didn't have any children. Her husband was elderly, as it mentions here in verse 14. So Elisha told her that she would have a son. And she was amazed by that, but sure enough it took place. And then as the story goes on, the child grew on out of infancy, evidently still a young child, but a little boy, maybe up 7, 8 years old, something of that sort. And he was out in the field with his father and began to complain, say his head hurt, and they took him back to the house. One of the servants took him back to his mother, and they brought him in there, and he sat there with her and died. Just a very quick thing. And this, she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, of Elisha, closed the door and left. And she took off to go see Elisha. And the story is, of course, that as she got there, Elisha offered to send his servant, and she said she didn't want the servant, she wanted him. So the servant was dispatched by Elisha, but he went with the woman. They got there a little later and came into the room, and Elisha prayed, and the child was resurrected. Actually, was healed and was restored to life. So this goes on, and then a little bit later, verse 38, Elisha is going to Gilgal, one of the places of the sons of the prophets, one of the schools that Elijah had founded, and we find here that there was a problem. He got there, and there had evidently been some poisonous things that had been put into the pot of stew, and they couldn't eat of it. And so Elisha performs a miracle, and the food is miraculously, the poison is removed, and God performed a miracle there. So anyway, as the story goes on in chapter 5, we've sort of laid a little bit of foundation. Now we come to Naaman, who was the captain of the host of the king of Syria. And he was a very noted individual, and yet he was a leper, had this dread disease. The Syrians had taken captives from Israel, and among those captives was a little girl. And she was a servant in the household of Naaman and his wife. And she evidenced a very simple, childlike faith. In fact, it's quite a contrast, her attitude and the king of Israel's attitude. All recorded here in 2 Kings 5. And then you can contrast that with the attitude of Gehazi, who was Elisha's servant. Several people, we find, now this little girl just in a very simple way, she told her mistress, she said, I wish the master were down in Israel because there's a prophet down there I know could heal him. Oh, I wish he were down there. She had sympathy and compassion on her masters there, and Naaman didn't have any. He had no hope of any. There was nothing that anyone knew of. So he went to the king of Syria. This at least was something. And the little girl had seemed so sincere and so certain about it. Well, I know, there's a man of God in Israel, and I know he could take care of it. So Naaman went to the king of Syria, and the king of Syria wrote this letter. If you're going to send your chief, your general down there, well, you write a letter to the other king. And so he figured, you'd think, well, if this little girl knew about Elisha, well, don't you think the king should have known about him? So the king of Syria writes this letter to the king of Israel and said, I'm sending my servant Naaman down there. I really think a lot of Naaman, and he's got this disease, and I'm sending him down there so that he can be healed. Well, when the king of Israel got that, he was just ready to tear his hair out. He said, this guy is picking for a fight. What can I do? There's nothing I can do to heal him. He sends him to me to be healed. And he was all excited and upset about it. And Elisha heard about that. And he sent word to the king of Israel. This is in verse 8. Why don't you send him down to me? Then you'll know there's a prophet in Israel. See, here's the attitude. Here's the little girl that she had very simple faith. King of Israel didn't have any of that. Naaman came down there. Now, Naaman, like a lot of us, we project in our minds and we sort of figure out the way we think things will be. Have you ever done that? You sort of get all worked up about something. And Naaman could just imagine, he was going to come down there and Elisha was going to come out and call on the name of his God. And there would be this great, big, dramatic sort of a show that would go on. And Naaman just had this thing all figured out. And, he was, figured Elisha was going to be this very impressive man and there was going to be this great thing. And Elisha didn't even come out of the house. Sent his servant out and said, what you need to do is go down to the Jordan River over here, just a little ways away. Go down to the Jordan and bathe 7 times. Naaman was furious. Elisha hadn't even come out. Go bathe in the Jordan. The Jordan's this muddy little stream. Why, we've got a lot of rivers better than that back where I come from. If you need to bathe in a river, I bathe in one of those. He was so upset. It says he was wroth and he went away. He just, thinking, well, I thought this was going to be some great ceremony and here nothing is going on. And one of his servants came to him and said, look, what if he had asked you to do something really hard? Climb the highest mountain, swim the deepest sea. If he had asked you to do something really difficult, you would have attempted it, wouldn't you? Oh, well, yeah, that would have sort of fit in with the plan. He said, well, all he asked you to do was something very simple. And you'd have done, if it was hard, you'd have done it. This is easy. Naaman got thinking about it. It took a little bit of humility to go down there and dip in this old muddy river. And he went down there, and sure enough, this is, as it says here in verse 14, his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Not only did it heal him of leprosy, this was the best anti-aging cream that anybody come up with. It not only got rid of the leprosy, it got rid of the wrinkles. His skin was like a little child, he came back and he was really impressed. Verse 15, behold, now I know there's no God in all the earth but in Israel. And I want to make this gift. I want to give you this money. And Elisha said, no, I don't take that. Won't take that. And it was urged on him, and Elisha refused. Well, Naaman carried some earth back from Israel. It's sort of the idea that, he could worship the God of Israel on the soil of Israel. But he didn't get very far down the road until we find that Gehazi Elisha's servant begins, the wheels are turning in his mind. So he follows Naaman, verse 21. And when Naaman saw him running, he stopped the chariot and got out to meet him. Everything okay? And Gehazi said, everything's fine, but my master sent me. Just after you left, there came a couple of fellows, a couple of our students, and they're sort of destitute. And he was just wondering if maybe you could send some of those things you were offered to give him, send it back. And Naaman said, why, sure, and he had Naaman or Gehazi had asked for a talent of silver, and he said, well, here, go ahead and take 2 talents, Naaman was feeling in a very expansive mood and sent a couple of his servants back to help carry all this stuff. And so they came back, and Gehazi hid it away and came in where Elisha was. And Elisha says, where you been? And he said, oh, nowhere, just, sort of around, just hanging around the house here. And Elisha says, look, don't you think that I know where you were? I know exactly what you've done. The leprosy of Naaman shall cleave unto you and your seed forever. Now, think about it. Think of what Gehazi had seen. He'd been Elisha's servant. He saw the little child healed, little child resurrected from the dead. First, the miraculous birth that took place. Next, the little child was raised from the dead. He had seen all of these miracles that Elisha had performed, or God actually performed the miracles through Elisha, right on down to the healing of Naaman. But yet, Gehazi, God wasn't really real to him. You have to conclude that. He thought that he could go down and he was greedy, and he thought, well, he could get this money and nobody would ever find out. It illustrates the point. Sometimes we think if we could just see a great miracle, it'd solve all our problems forever. Well, that's not the case. It's just not. And Gehazi had seen all these miracles, but still God wasn't real to him. You don't do something like that. If God's real to you and you're aware that He's watching, you're going to go and pull some stunt like this and think you're going to hide it. Nobody's going to find out. Gehazi was living his life before Elisha. He wasn't living his life before God. He thought if he hid it over here, how would Elisha know? Well, we come on down a little further, and one other thing to consider is it was not that the water in the Jordan River had any particular healing power. Naaman demonstrated his willingness to obey. He demonstrated his willingness to obey. It took humility and it took obedience, and that was what God was looking for. It took some faith. He was sure going to feel stupid if he stepped out there in that old river and everybody, he's got all these people up watching, and he goes out there in the river, in this old sort of muddy river, and he goes out there and he does this, and he comes out and nothing is any different. This has to be going through his mind. What are his servants going to think? They're going to stand there and sort of snicker, and he's going to be a laughing stock for having gone down there and done this. So it took humility, it took faith, and it took obedience, which is exactly the same thing it takes for us. The specifics may be different, but that's what God's looking for in each of us. As you come on down through the story in chapter 6, we read of the account here where the Syrians had sent an army down, and there was a king of Syria had been told, that the reason why Israel knew everything that was going on was because of Elisha. So Elisha's servant got up very early, we're told in chapter 6, verse 15, and he saw these Syrian troops surrounding the city. And he came back in, he was all excited and upset, and Elisha had a very simple answer. He says, don't fear. There are more with us than there are with them. And that was The servant must have thought you hadn't looked out the window yet. You don't know what's out there. Elisha prayed, and God performed a miracle and allowed this servant to actually see the spirit realm. And he saw horses and chariots of fire just covering the place. I think that that is something that we sometimes don't realize, the extent that God is involved. Well, the army was smitten with blindness, and Elisha led them on in to Samaria, and then opened their eyes, and here they saw they were surrounded. Now they were here they were coming to capture Elisha, and Elisha had captured them. And the king of Israel looked up there, at Elisha, and he says, "Shall I smite him? Shall I smite him?" And Elisha says, "Why would you do a thing like that? If you took somebody captive with your sword and your bow, would you smite them after you brought them here captured? Give them something to eat and drink and send them back home." So that's what they did, and so they didn't. This particular group didn't come back. Well, later on, there was a siege of Samaria and famine, and the king of Israel is all upset. And who is he blaming? He's blaming Elisha. It's all the prophet's fault. So Elisha makes the statement, verse 32, word gets to him. He's sitting in his house, and the elders sitting with him. And the king sent a man from before him. Before the messenger came, he said to the elders, "You see how this son of a murderer is sent to take away my head?" That's who he is. That's the way Elisha referred to him, this son of a murderer. Going back to Ahab and Jezebel. So when the messenger came, they didn't let him in, and then Elisha said, "Look, here's what God's message is, that the famine," because the city was in a terrible famine because there had been a siege. He says the famine is going to be over. Why? You're going to be just virtually giving away food. And one of the servants there with the king made this sort of smart aleck answer. He said, "Why, if the Lord opened the windows of heaven, you couldn't get that much food here that quickly. Food prices couldn't drop that much." And that was Elisha told him. He said, "Well, you're going to see it, but you're not going to eat of it." Well, the story, of course, as you go on, is that God had made the host of the Syrians, verse 6, to hear a noise of chariots and horses, and they got scared and ran. They heard this and just became terrorized. So they had left all of the food that they had. And when word got here to the city that the Syrians were gone, people came rushing out the gate, running out there to get the food. And this servant of the king's, who had been so smart aleck the day before, wound up actually getting trampled and dying. He, in that sense, literally, Elisha's prophecy came to pass. He saw it, but he never did get to partake of it. And so then Elisha told this woman that whose son he had restored to life, told her and her family to go and sojourn in another place because God was calling a famine upon the land. And this woman went and did that. And 7 years later she came back, and somebody in the meantime had taken her land. The indication is her husband must have been dead, because he's not mentioned in this account. And sure enough, she comes to the king, and Gehazi has been talking to the king. The king's been quizzing him about Elisha, and he was telling him about this great miracle of the little child being raised to life. When this woman comes and petitions the king to enforce the law and to let her have her property back. And sure enough, here the king's just finished hearing this story, so he does that and takes care of that. Well, as the story goes on through, and we find that Elisha is used to do certain things that in terms of the king of Syria, there's going to be a new king. Hazael is going to be king of Syria, and we find that Jehu is going to be the new king of Israel. That the line of Ahab and Jezebel is going to be brought to an end in Israel. Now, in what we find is the story here in 2 Kings chapter 8 of this change of rulers on the throne. We find that Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, began to reign in Judah. He was married to the daughter of Ahab, Athaliah, and so this was the case as it comes on down. And he walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, and he died, and his son became king. And this is described here in the end of chapter 8. Now, Elisha had, in chapter 9, we have the story of Jehu being anointed as king over Israel. And sure enough, Jehu is being raised up to destroy the house of Ahab. This is a fulfillment of Elijah's prophecy. So this comes on down, and we find that Jehu has himself proclaimed as king. And Joram is down there. Jehu is riding in a chariot. Verse 16, went to Jezreel. Joram lay there, and Ahaziah king of Judah was come down to see Jehoram. And they were watching in a distance, and they saw this company coming. They could see the dust of the chariots, and so they come on out, and the king says to Jehu in verse 18, "Have you come in peace?" And send out and find out if he comes in peace. And Jehu says in verse 19, "What do you have to do with peace?" So Jehu's coming closer and closer. He's coming down there. The king sent his servants out to go see who it was, and the servant never came back. And so the dust cloud is getting closer. And they said in verse 20, they said, "Well, must be Jehu. The driving is like the driving of Jehu. He drives furiously." So Jehu is the kind of guy that evidently, if you'd put him in an automobile, he'd have been ripping 100 miles an hour down the freeway. He had a reputation for being sort of a just taking off that way. Well, they recognized who it was by the driving. Jehu came there, and he said in verse 22 to Joram, he said, "What peace so long as the whoredoms of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many?" And Jehu drew his bow and killed Jehoram the king. And then Ahaziah, king of Judah, when he saw this, he fled. And so he was killed too in the process, and was taken back to Jerusalem and buried. Now Jehu comes on into Samaria, and when Jehu, verse 30, was come to Jezreel, actually to Jezreel, not to Samaria, this is where they were. Jezebel, see, is still alive. Ahab is dead, and her son is king. Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her face and tired her head and looked out the window. You know, she decorated up. And notice the thing that you find about Jezebel. It mentions in verse 22 her whoredoms. You know, Jezebel is the one who is the model for what God describes in Revelation 17 as the great whore that commits fornication with the kings of the earth. Jezebel was noted, we're told in verse 22, for her whoredom and her witchcraft. So she was this was, the way that she had exercised power in terms of seducing various kings, and evidently was noted for that, had that reputation, and but her old tricks didn't work this time, because Jehu looked up there when she was looking out the window and says, "Who's on my side?" And a couple of eunuchs stuck their head out, and he says, "Throw her down." And so they did, and of course she was killed. And he came on in and ate his meal. He was you wouldn't say Jehu was a particularly sensitive soul. He came on in, ate and drank, and then he told somebody, he said, "Well, I guess you better go bury this cursed woman." Well, when they went out there wasn't anything left. The dogs had come and eaten her up, and just left a few remains. A grisly end to a very grisly person. Again, God had prophesied that was what was going to happen to Jezebel. I think we have to understand, try to look at it from a standpoint of God's perspective, and how ugly and how evil what God viewed Jezebel and her actions and her behavior. And I think she's really the one that's sort of used as the model back there in Revelation 17. When you look at the in Revelation 2, and it talks about using Jezebel to symbolize the false church. It talks about you have talking to a couple of the churches, that woman Jezebel who seduces my servants, is mentioned in Revelation 2. So Jezebel was not only a historical person, but she set an example that made her a model for everything God hates. And so she's used as a model for the false church, referred to in Revelation 2 on a couple of occasions, where she sort of personifies that. I think really the description in Revelation 17 fits her as well, because what do you find about the great whore of Babylon? What's she noted for? Her harlotry, her whoredoms, and her witchcraft. And that's what Jezebel was noted for. So anyway, we find this. Now, Jehu went on to gather all the sons of Ahab and was responsible for killing them. And this is this punishment that was going to come on the house of Ahab for their Baal worship, and this was done. And yet, we find that in spite of all of this, verse 31, Jehu, this is verse 10, Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart. He departed not from the sins of Jeroboam. And in those days, the Lord began to cut Israel short. Various problems and various things began to come up. And Jehu reigned 28 years and he died. Now we pick up the story in chapter 11 with Athaliah, who was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, and she was the mother of the king of Judah that Jehu slew, Ahaziah. And when she saw he was dead, she decided to try to wipe out all her grandchildren and make herself queen. There was one little baby, one little grandson that was hidden, that she didn't know about, and he was hidden in the temple. The 6 years went by, and in the 7th year, this priest, the high priest Jehoiada, got together people, and they decided the time had come to crown this young king, Joash. And so they brought forth the king's son, verse 12, put the crown upon him, gave him the testimony, and made him king. It's interesting what the insignia were when they made someone king. They anointed him. They gave him a crown and the testimony. In other words, he was given a copy of the Scriptures, because that was the responsibility of the king. You wonder how many of them actually did it, but the commandment was that the king was supposed to make his own handwritten copy of the law. So when he was crowned, the crown was put on his head. He was given a copy of the testimony, given the Bible, or the parts of the Bible that existed at that time, that he could have that to study and to actually go through and make his own copy. But so we find that Athaliah heard all this noise, and she came into the temple, and she looked, verse 14, and the king stood by a pillar, as the manner was. And when Athaliah saw it, she cried, "Treason, treason." Now, I think the significance here, some translations said the king stood upon the pillar. I think the pillar is none other than the Jacob's pillar, because if you notice, there were a lot of, if you're talking about just upright columns, there are all kind of pillars in the temple, but he was standing by one, as the manner was. She looked over, she saw this little boy, and instantly she knew what happened. Why? Because she saw that it was a coronation. He was standing on the coronation stone. Then instantly, when Jehoiada, the priest, had her taken out and executed. And Jehoiada made a covenant, verse 17, between the Lord and the king and the people, that they would all be the Lord's people, between the king and the people. Well, things went on along. If we go to the parallel account over in Chronicles, chapter 24 talks about Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign. Now, it's interesting, 2 Chronicles 24, verse 2, Joash did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. And as we come on down through the story, we find that Jehoiada got old, verse 15 of 2 Chronicles 24. He was 130 years old, very elderly man, and he died. And they buried him there among the royal tombs. Then we find, verse 17, after the death of Jehoiada, came the princes of Judah and made obeisance to the king. Then the king hearkened unto them. And they left the house of the Lord God of their fathers and served groves and idols. Joash was one of those individuals who was heavily influenced by others. Joash, if there was a good influence, Joash could do okay. As long as Jehoiada was alive, Joash conformed and he went along. But when Jehoiada was gone, and now these others came along and said, "Hey, let's go have some fun. Let's go do this. Let's go do that." Joash went along with them. And we've all known people that way, and I think we see have seen examples, individuals who do okay as long as they are in sort of a structured setting or there's a positive influence. But nothing is internalized. Joash went along, he conformed. He was evidently a sort of a compliant fellow. But he had no depth of character, no depth of conviction. And, we've seen that sort of thing that, comes along. One of the things that we also want to, let's go back and look at 2 Chronicles 21. Let's turn back a few pages. 2 Chronicles 21. We find that Jehoshaphat died, and Joram his son reigned, as we've already seen. And Jehoram, we're told in verse 6, walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. Jehoram, remember, was married to Athaliah. He had Ahab's daughter for his wife. But God wouldn't destroy the house of David because of the covenant with David. But problems went on. And there were revolts and there were difficulties. And verse 12, interesting verse, there came a writing to him from Elijah the prophet, saying, Thus says the Lord God of David your father, because you've not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat your father, nor in the ways of Asa king of Judah, but you walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. You've made the inhabitants of Jerusalem to go a-whoring, that a plague is going to smite your people. And you're going to have this terrible disease. Now, remember when we were going through back at the beginning of 2 Kings, when Elijah was taken up into the whirlwind, Jehoshaphat was still king of Judah. In fact, even later, Elisha comes down. You remember Jehoshaphat came down to help out Jehoram, king of Israel, and Elisha comes out there and talks to him and responds because of his respect for Jehoshaphat. The point is, when you put the two accounts together, what you find is here is Elijah writing a letter several years after he had been taken up in the whirlwind. He didn't write this letter until after Jehoshaphat's death and after Jehoshaphat's son was on the throne. Well, if Elijah was in the heaven that most people think he was, what was this? The original airmail? You know, he sort of dropped the letter and it just scooted on down. No, Elijah was taken somewhere. We're not told where. But evidently he was taken, he was close enough that he knew what was going on or got reports of what was going on, and he wrote a letter. And the letter was delivered. So this is one evidence, just one thing to show that Elijah was on earth and still doing something somewhere a number of years after he'd been taken up into in the chariot. Well, we'll come back to the account here in 2 Kings, follow that on through when Joash died, and after a period of time, and the new king Amaziah, his son, came to the throne. That's mentioned here in chapter 14, verse 1. The dynasty of Jehu was ruling in Israel at this time, and Amaziah came to the throne. He reigned 29 years and did that which was right, not wholeheartedly, but certainly a lot better than what some of the others had done. And he goes on and tells his account and his death. Then we find that in verse 16, Jeroboam II becomes king of Israel, and then we find that there was another king that came to the throne in Judah. Verse 21, called Azariah, also called Uzziah. He had two names, and different accounts use different names for him. He came to the throne when he was 16, as it mentions in verse 21. And he built Elat, which was the port there on the top of the Red Sea or Gulf of Aqaba, restored it to Judah, and it mentions here about his reign and the reign of Jeroboam II over Israel, and how he restored the coasts of Israel, as it mentions in verse 25. And talks about also in verse 25, according to the word of the Lord God of Israel, which he spoke by the hand of his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai. You can go back to the book of Jonah, chapter 1, verse 1, realize it's the same man. So God would not blot the nation out, and this story is told here of their interaction. And what we find as we go to the parallel account in 2 Chronicles, we read a little bit more about this Azariah, or Uzziah, as he is better known, called Uzziah here in Jeremiah, in 2 Chronicles 26:1, and it tells the story of what he did. But we find that even though he was used in a significant way, notice the problem. 2 Chronicles 26:16. Uzziah, when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. He transgressed against the Lord his God and went into the temple of the Lord to burn incense upon the altar of incense. And Azariah the priest went in with him 80 priests, valiant men. And they withstood Uzziah the king. And they said, it doesn't pertain to you to burn incense. That pertains to the priests that are consecrated. You have trespassed. You get out of the sanctuary. Verse 19, Uzziah was wroth. He was furious. You can't talk to me that way. I'm the king. And he had the censer in his hand to burn incense. And when he got so mad, all of a sudden leprosy began to come out started there in his forehead and began to spread over his body. And when he realized that he was leprous, then he himself hasted out of the temple. And he was scared now. And he was a leper till the day he died. And his son Jotham became king in his stead and actually reigned during the latter years, was like co-regent. Now, it's an interesting story. So often it happens. It's easy to be humble when you don't have anything. Fellow's down and out and is impressed by his total lack of self-sufficiency. It's easy to be humble. But the problem that we see often happens is that with prosperity, as a person gets a little older and sort of get things in hand, and he prospered and he was king, the statement is that his heart was lifted up. He was strong and his heart was lifted up. See, he quit being so humble because he was strong. He was able to accomplish all these things, and he began to think that he was the one who had actually restored Judah's borders. He was sort of proud of himself. Look at all that I've done. So he got his focus off of God and onto himself, and then he thought, well, he would, he was entitled to carry out any ceremony, the most important things in the nation. He should be able to do all of it. And he went into the temple. Even here, God gave him a chance to change. His pride caused him to pull this stunt. But even then, he was confronted by the priests and told to leave. He was at a juncture. How was he going to receive the correction? We got curious. You can't talk to me that way. I'm the king. God said, okay, we'll find out who the king is. All of a sudden, he's covered with leprosy. See, if he had repented at that moment, right on down even to this point, God still gave him a chance to change. And he refused the chance. And then he was leprous. But it's a good lesson for us to learn. One of the most difficult, let's say one of the most difficult things to maintain when we're successful is humility. Uzziah was a successful king. And his humility got lost in the process. So, and humility is a key to pleasing God. You can't accept correction. You can't grow if you won't be corrected, and you can't be corrected unless you're humble. Because somebody who's filled with a lot of pride and vanity is not going to accept correction. And it's a valuable lesson for us to learn. It's not that God is against success and prosperity, but we should realize that with success and prosperity, one of the greatest tests is the ability to really remain humble. And if we see the real source of our success, then if we really see things in perspective, then humility shouldn't be a problem. Because if you see how big God is and how little you are, why would it be hard to be humble? But humanly, we can get our eyes off of God and onto the around if we're not careful. So we continue on our account that we've seen here in 2 Kings 14 as to on the latter part of the chapter as to how Jeroboam sort of gave Israel their last fling at prosperity. That sort of sets the stage for the book of Micah. And you find that Micah is indicting Israel as a wealthy, commercial, urban society. Very interesting, because what you find is that the situation was not dissimilar to what we have in our nation. That's why the prophecies of Micah apply today, just as much as they applied way back then. Well, as we come on down through the story, we come into this final phase here. After Jeroboam's death, there was a period of instability in Israel. You go through a number of kings in a relatively short period of time that's outlined here in chapter 15 and 16, and results in the collapse of Israel, the conquest of Israel by the Assyrians. And that is described here in chapter 16, 15, 16, and getting on into chapter 17. What we find in chapter 17 is that the Assyrians took Samaria. This is chapter 17, verse 6. Carried Israel away into Assyria, placed them in Hala, Habor, by the rivers of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes, up in that area sort of between the Black and the Caspian Sea. And we find that God took them into captivity. This took place over a little period of time, and because they never really repented. Now, the people that came to be known as Samaritans, their origin is mentioned in verse 24 of 2 Kings 17. The king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and some of the surrounding towns, and he placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria. And then they wanted a priest from Israel to come and teach them the manner of the God of the land. Verse 27. One of the priests that they had taken away from Samaria dwelt there, and he taught them, verse 28, how they should fear the Lord. Well, don't you know, he did a good job. He was the one that had made... Where did he come from? Well, he was one of the priests of Samaria. Well, where did the priests of Samaria come from? They were the ones Jeroboam had appointed. He was descended from Jeroboam's priesthood. So what he taught them to do was to take the name of the God of Israel and to attach that to their old paganism. That's what you find. You see, it's summed up as to what they did, and as it says in verse 32. So they feared the Lord and made unto themselves of the lowest of them priests of the high places. Verse 33, they feared the Lord and served their own gods. They continue to do all this stuff, verse 34, all the way down. And verse 41, these nations feared the Lord and served their graven images. That's Samaritanism. That's what sets the background for some of what we're going to be looking at next Bible study when we look at Ezra and Nehemiah. This is why Ezra and Nehemiah and Joshua and Zerubbabel, why God's true servants didn't want to have anything to do with the Samaritans. Because they paid lip service to the God of Israel. They talked about the Bible. They used some of the right terminology. But they didn't really serve God. They served their graven images. They just practiced Babylonian paganism, attaching God's name to it. Now, does that sound familiar? That's why Simon the sorcerer from Samaria, see, he was the chief of the Samaritan religion. Well, this is what the Samaritan religion was. He was the ideal man to launch what became ultimately the Catholic Church, which basically fears the Lord and serves their graven images. They use God's name. They talk about God and the Bible and Jesus Christ, but in reality, they practice Babylonian paganism. So the story comes on down, and we pick up the parallel account here in Judah. Ahaz and Hezekiah came to the throne. Ahaz was not a good king. He was one who was a wicked king, but his son Hezekiah became king, and Hezekiah was one who served God wholeheartedly. 2 Chronicles 29, 30, and 31 tells the story of Hezekiah's great revival, the great Passover of Hezekiah that was preceded by the repair of the temple that Hezekiah was responsible for, because his father had Ahaz had let the temple fall into disrepair. In fact, you read of Ahaz that talks about here in 2 Chronicles 28, and Ahaz in 2 Chronicles 28:24 gathered together the vessels of the house of God, cut in pieces the vessels of the house of God, shut up the doors of the house of the Lord, made altars in every corner of Jerusalem. And so he did all sorts of things. And the parallel account back in Kings, back in 2 Kings, tells about how Ahaz had asked the king of Assyria to help him defeat Damascus, and he went up there to meet the king of Assyria there in Damascus, that he was so impressed with the big idol altar there in Damascus that he had a pattern made and sent down to Jerusalem. He wanted one like that to replace the old altar in the temple. Now, that's an interesting story, because where did the pattern of the altar in the temple come from? Well, as Paul explains in Hebrews, and he's quoting from Exodus, Moses was told, make all these things according to the pattern that I showed you in the mount. God set the pattern for worship. Solomon patterned the altar in the temple after the altar Moses had built. Moses got the pattern from God. Ahaz got his pattern from Damascus. He thought they had a nice altar. And so he cut up the vessels in God's temple and made this idolatrous altar. You don't get your pattern of worship from the world. You don't look around and say, well, that's pretty impressive. That's a nice ceremony. That's a nice thing to do. I think we'll take that and we'll do. Well, you worship God according to the pattern He sets. God sets the pattern. Acceptable worship to God involves adherence to the pattern that He set. Well, the story of Hezekiah, Hezekiah is responsible for, we can read about it in chapter 29, 30, 31. One of the things we find in chapter 30, verse 1, Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah, wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh, that they should come to the house of the Lord at Jerusalem and keep the Passover. They decided to, they're going to keep the Passover in the second month, because they weren't able to sanctify the priest or the temple in time to do it the first time. But the proclamation went out and told the people of Israel, who were in the process of being deported, to come and keep the Passover, because they hadn't done it for a long time, as it was written, we're told in verse 5. And the response was that They were told in verse 8, the Israelites, Hezekiah didn't rule over Israel, he ruled over Judah, but he's sending a message, a final warning to Israel who's being deported. And he says, don't be stiff-necked like your fathers were. This is 2 Chronicles 30, verse 8. Yield yourselves to the Lord, enter the sanctuary, which he sanctified forever, and serve the Lord your God, that the fierceness of his wrath may pass away. If you turn again unto the Lord, your brethren and your children shall find compassion, and they'll come back to this land. The Lord is gracious and merciful, and he will not turn his face from you if you return unto him. And they passed through various parts of Israel, Ephraim, Manasseh, Zebulun. They laughed them to scorn, mocked them. There were a few individuals who came, who humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. So we find what they took the altars, Hezekiah did, and cast them into the brook Kidron. He destroyed the old altar that his father had made, and all these things, and they observed the Passover, and this is described. And then, chapter 31, they went out to the cities of Judah and broke the images down, and then they proceeded to go on up into parts of Israel, and everybody went back home. Now, the story is a message of repentance that was brought out. We find that Hezekiah was a man that was very wholehearted. 2 Kings 18:5 tells us he trusted the Lord God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor any that were before him. So he was a man of great faith. And he kept the commandments. You read the account, one of the dramatic accounts, in the 14th year of Hezekiah, Sennacherib came up to besiege Jerusalem. And you read of Hezekiah at the same... When you put the accounts together, you find that was the same time. That was right in the context of when Hezekiah got sick. He was sick and going to die. You ever feel like everything's, crashing in at the same time? So here he is, sick and going to die, and the place is surrounded. And Hezekiah goes to God and really besought God. God healed him, performed a dramatic miracle to demonstrate that he would add these years to Hezekiah's life, and sent an angel and destroyed the army of Sennacherib. And one angel, one army. It's not hard for God to do. This tremendous army that was destroyed. It mentions this here in 2 Kings 18:13. That in the 14th year of Hezekiah, Sennacherib came, took the fenced cities, and so as it comes on down, Hezekiah went in and he Isaiah came to Hezekiah. This is described in chapter 19 of 2 Kings. And we find that Hezekiah received the letter demanding surrender, verse 14. He went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. And he said, Lord, you that dwell between the cherubim, you're God, you alone. Bow down your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see. Listen to the words of Sennacherib. He just sort of spread the letter out and said, God, you can see what he's saying. I'm powerless to solve this problem, but I know you can. And so God did intervene and destroyed the Assyrian army. And that's described here in verse 35. And chapter 20 says, in those days Hezekiah was sick to death. So he doesn't get past one problem before he's got another. And yet he really besought God, and God intervened and healed him. And God gave him that deliverance. Then his son Manasseh became king, and Manasseh was just as wicked as his father had been, wholehearted and righteous. And we're actually told that it was the sins of Manasseh that God says in verse 11, 2 Kings 21:11, because Manasseh king of Judah has done these abominations. Verse 12, therefore, thus says the Lord God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such evil upon Jerusalem and Judah that whoever hears of it, both his ears shall tingle. I'm going to stretch over Jerusalem the line of Samaria and the plummet of the house of Ahab. I'm going to wipe Jerusalem like a man wipes a dish. And this is what was going to happen because of the sins of Manasseh. And the people just wholeheartedly... God allows sometimes a contrast. A righteous king like Hezekiah was raised up. He led the nation in a revival. He set things on track. Then he died. And God allowed somebody else to come along to, in a sense, to measure the depth of the people's commitment. And what you find is very shallow. We went through that in the church. Very similar parallel. You see, Mr. Armstrong, in the last 7 years of his life, talked about, you go back and you look at any of the old worldwide newses, you remember, he kept talking about putting church back on track, putting the church back on track. And then what was the result? Well, you see, the time came, the message was given, the warning was given, the correction was given for the drift that things had had earlier in the 70s. And the reason it needed to be put back on track was because it had gotten off track. And Mr. Armstrong emphasized that over and over. And then the next thing you know, it's like the old crowd that had run things through back in the 70s. Next thing you knew, here they were. And they didn't just run it back to what they had done then. They just kept going and went further and further and further. But it serves as a test, you see. What is the depth of conviction that people have? God allowed Manasseh. God could have caused Manasseh to die. Could have seen that somebody else succeeded Hezekiah. But you see, the people had been given a chance. They'd been given a warning. They'd been given a chance. They had had a time of revival and a time of when things were headed in a positive way. Now, what we need to find out is how sincere are they? What's their commitment? Well, it wasn't much. Manasseh died, and his son Ammon reigned for just a short time, a couple of years, and then his little grandson Josiah, who was 8 years old, began to reign. And Josiah, we're told in 2 Kings 22:2, did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, and he walked in all the ways of David, turned not to the right hand or to the left. And Josiah set out to repair the temple and to do all of these things that sought to obey God and to serve God wholeheartedly. It talks about his reforms here in chapter 22 and 23, and how Josiah sought to really lead the nation in reform. When you go back to the parallel account in 2 Chronicles 34, Josiah begins to reign. Chapter 35 tells the story of the great Passover that he kept and how wholehearted he was. We're told in verse 16 here of 2 Chronicles 35, they kept the Passover. Verse 17, they all kept the Passover in the days of unleavened bread. Verse 18, there was no Passover like to that kept in Israel from the days of Samuel the prophet. Neither did all the children of Israel keep such a Passover as Josiah kept. And, the one thing that would be outstanding about that, if you say, well, Hezekiah's Passover was a great Passover, and it was. Josiah, they were able to keep the Passover at the appropriate time rather than on the second Passover. But it was wholehearted. This was in the 18th year of Josiah. And it was wholehearted. But the nation as a whole did not get on track. And Josiah died, and we read in verse 24 of 2 Chronicles 35 that all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. Verse 25, Jeremiah lamented for Josiah, and all the singing men and the singing women spoke of Josiah in their lamentations to this day. Made them an ordinance in Israel. They're written in the Lamentations. That's the book we have in the Bible, the book of Lamentations. The Lamentations of Jeremiah, it's called. You see, God had made the promise after Josiah, the reform at the time of Josiah. God made the promise that He would not bring captivity upon Judah as long as Josiah lived. Well, when Josiah died, that was it. Because we find that his sons were not really on track, and this was sort of the end of the rope. You know, God is patient, God's merciful, but there comes a point when God draws the line. He says, you've had an opportunity to change, and you didn't. And so these things began to happen, and again, this period of instability here in the end of the time of Judah, Jehoiahaz became king, and he was king. He was Josiah's son. He was king for a little while, but then the king of Egypt got involved, and he put him down and made his brother king, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. And he reigned for a little while and did that which was evil. Nebuchadnezzar came up, 2 Chronicles 36 verse 6, hauled him off to Babylon in fetters, in chains, and made his son Jehoiakim or Jehoiachin king in his stead. And he reigned for a little while. And then the king Nebuchadnezzar later brought him to Babylon and made Zedekiah, who was also the last of these sons of Josiah, made him king. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and didn't humble himself. 2 Chronicles 36:12, didn't humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, and who had made him swear by God. But he stiffened his neck and hardened his heart, wouldn't turn to God, and so, sure enough, he was. All these things were taken, and the Babylonians came in, and they hauled off all of the treasures of the temple, verse 18, to Babylon. They burnt, verse 19, the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all the palaces with fire. And this fulfilled the prophecies of Jeremiah. Then, sort of this addendum here, the last two verses of 2 Chronicles are the first two verses of the book of Ezra. And that just follows the story through. The final account back in 2 Kings is well that 2 Kings 25 tells of the siege of Jerusalem and how the city was broken up. 2 Kings 25:4, and how the king was captured. His sons were slain in front of him, and then his eyes were put out, and he was hauled off to Babylon in chains. And they burnt the king's house and the house of the Lord. And it describes that this process that began, as it says in 2 Kings 25:8, in the 5th month, the 7th day of the month, the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar. And this, what they did and the destruction that took place. So we find that the Jews were carried into captivity. Jerusalem was destroyed. The consequences came on the nation for a lack of obedience. And that's a valuable and an important lesson. God's word will stand. We've had a swift overview of the history of Israel and Judah here this evening in the latter part of their history, and with that we'll be concluded on this part, and then we'll pass out questions for next time.